Hello, everybody. There are no students here this evening for CG 442. I know this is an inconvenient time for some of you. You have another class. So when there aren't any students available and when I haven't gotten any requests for specific topics to cover, I may or may not have a session. Tonight I will have one and just talk about a few of the topics that are traditionally difficult for students as they finish up CG 442 in the second section as they finish up respiration. So let's go ahead. First of all, there is a calendar question. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the academic calendar, and let's see if we can't share. So this is the Cal State Northridge academic calendar for this spring. And of course, this was pre-coronavirus, so it's hard to know exactly what's going to be happening the rest of the semester. I do know that at least one other Cal State is considering going completely to online classes. And of course, you guys are old hands at that, right? So it's not going to be a big deal for this class. But the question really is, are we going to stay on exactly the schedule? And I think the answer is largely yes, we are. But the issue is going to be whether or not graduation or commencement would be held. Those are traditionally big crowd events. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Same thing goes for your classes where you attend in person. So we'll see. Okay, so as you can see here, we are coming up on spring break, which will be next week, the 16th through the 22nd. In other words, all next week. There is no instruction on that date. Campus is not closed during this time, so offices in departments are still open. But there are no classes that are held, and most of the faculty, like most of the students, are off campus. Okay, so now having taken a look at that, we're going to just look ahead to the last day of instruction. That's going to be the beginning of 8, be here sooner than you can possibly imagine. Having discussed that, let's go back to the main module homepage on Canvas. And I'm going to get us to that homepage. Okay, so this will be the first page of our joint CD 442 website. So I thought I was pretty good at putting up this little graph that talked about the change in the date for quiz number 4, which will be the next quiz. I still didn't get it right. So it's basically the same, but the start date will be on a Wednesday, like it always is. So I will send that around in an announcement and maybe post yet one more corrected version of this. So the date for Wednesday is 3/25. So when it will be 3/25 through 3/29, just like it always is. Okay, and as long as we're on this page, let's go ahead and take a look at the modules and where we are. So I'll flip ahead here. So we're beginning week number 8, and indeed, if we look down past that, you can see the next week is spring break, March 16th through the 22nd. Okay, now in the march of, or the flow of information, you are in the larynx as you were last week. This week you are studying the intrinsic muscles of the larynx. And while I want to spend most of my time talking about the end of respiration, since that will be the topic of quiz number 4, I did want to take a brief detour at this point to remind you of a resource that I like. So this is the site that we've gone to before. It's called the Wes Norman. WesNorman.com is the name of it, but the formal name as it appears on the website is The Anatomy Lesson. Wes Norman is the anatomy professor. I'm going to go ahead and go to the head and neck section, and then from there to the section on the larynx. One of the things I like about this website is I think it looks really different from the drawings in your notes and the drawings in your textbook. So if you look here, I wanted to say a few brief words about the membranes because I sometimes think they get short coverage in our discussions. There are primarily 3 large membranes with some other smaller membranes. For example, the cricothyroid membrane. I'm sorry, and the cricothyroid is on here, sorry. So let's look at these. From the top down, I think about the thyrohyoid membrane essentially as the curtain that hangs down from the hyoid bone down to the thyroid. Sometimes you will see the hyothyroid membrane, not very often. And the fact that the convention is the thyrohyoid seems weird to me because the origin of the membrane really, I guess, many people consider to be the hyoid bone, and usually the origin is the first part of the name, but whatever. This sort of forms the curtain around the structures of the larynx. Moving inferiorly, the second membrane would be the quadrangular membrane. I think about the quadrangular membrane as being kind of, I guess, like a swagged curtain over a window. And the quadrangular part comes from its appearance. It does look like a quadrangle. And the lower margin of this membrane, which is located from the lateral aspect of the epiglottis to the arytenoid cartilages on each side. The lower part of that membrane terminates into what is known as the false vocal fold or the ventricular folds, almost as if there's like a ridge or something in the curtain at its lowest point, most inferior point. We talk about certain membranes as having free borders or free edges. And for the quadrangular membrane, the free border, free edge of interest is the one that sort of terminates in these bands of tissue or these bumps that we call the false vocal folds. The membrane below that, here it's labeled as the cricothyroid membrane, but I hear it most oftenly referred to by its other name, the conus elasticus, and that name is up here as well. So cricothyroid or conus elasticus. Conus elasticus is like an upside down funnel, they say, with the wide part of the funnel most inferiorly. And then the fibers rise towards another free edge, and that free edge is the true vocal folds. In this case, the true vocal folds are bands of muscle tissue, as you know from your studying. So the thyroarytenoid muscle. But those fibers in the cricothyroid membrane or the conus elasticus then terminate in their superior aspect into the true vocal fold. So again, there are these borders on these membranes, one inferior, one superior, that essentially are free, or meaning that they're not attached by cohesive tissue to some landmark in a way such that they can't and don't move. I'm not saying that the membrane fibers move around. They really can't unless they're influenced by muscle, right? But they're not firmly attached to some other cartilaginous or osseous structure, either in their inferior aspect up here, quadrangular membrane, free border is the false vocal folds, and the conus elasticus, or the cricothyroid membrane, terminates in its superior aspect with the true vocal folds. The other aspect of this website that I like, and I showed this to you before, is at the very end, where there are representations of movements of the arytenoids and the thyroid cartilage, and which muscles are responsible for moving those structures. So one of the things that you should strive for in terms of what to understand in this section of the course, that is the intrinsic muscles and the movement of the vocal folds, is what is the action that occurs when an intrinsic muscle of interest contracts. So let's say you were interested in the transverse arytenoid muscle, for example. What is the action that occurs when the transverse arytenoid contracts? And then the next logical step is, what happens to the voice when that muscle contracts and some action occurs? So there's sort of like 3 steps, and you might think about putting together a chart like that if it would be helpful for you. And that is the muscle, where it is, blah, blah, blah. The second part of that would be, what happens when that muscle contracts? Do the arytenoids move closer together? Do they rock forward? Does the distance between the arytenoids and the thyroid cartilage decrease? Whatever the action is, that's what you want to know. Then finally, what does that do in terms of voice production? Does it not have a singular important function? Does it, so for example, given the location of the transverse and the oblique arytenoids, do they somehow have a similar action on the arytenoids and thus a similar sort of voice result? Other muscles, you know, it's not entirely clear how to translate their movement into what happens to the voice, but there are some muscles, for example, the TA, thyroarytenoid, specifically the vocalis, the muscle body most closely associated with voicing. We know that certain things happen in terms of voice production when that muscle is tightened or is made more lax or lengthened, etc. Okay. One other thing on this website, and then we'll sort of take a detour back towards the end of respiration. And that last thing here is, I just wanted to point out that you know, it's easy to read these descriptions of these muscles and yet not understand how the fibers might work together. I'm looking around. My dog is patrolling and is hungry and is looking for things to eat. And I just want to make sure it's not something I really value, like my notes or something. Uh, okay, so one thing I wanted to show you here in this depiction is the rather excellent depiction of what the British would call the interarytenoids. That is the class name that they give to the transverse arytenoid with the fibers going across, and the oblique arytenoids with the fibers making that distinctive X shape. Even in a cadaver, so if you were to look at the Zemlin website that I've showed you before, if you looked at a cadaver picture of some of these mussels, you would still see that there's sort of this distinct X shape with these crosswise or transverse, as you know, bands underneath them. And so Americans and other parts of the world call these two bands by different names. One final detail, and that would be about the airy epiglottic mussel. Now, we don't think about, I don't think there's a lot of detail about the function of the airy epiglottic mussel in your section on phonation. And that is because I don't think we think about think that it has a huge role to play in voice loudness, voice quality, voice initiation, etc. But here in this drawing, we can see pretty clearly that the X-shaped bonds of the oblique arytenoids extend superiorly to the lateral aspect of the epiglottis. So all the way up to the superior aspect of this little drawing, in fact. And I think for a while, we didn't think that much about the airy epiglottic muscle. The important action was down here. But essentially, these fibers, the connection between them kind of disappears. And many people think of the airy epiglottic muscle as sort of an upwards extension of the obliques on each side. The airy epiglottic muscle kind of disappears into the airy epiglottic fold. So again, these are landmarks of the larynx. So I thought I'll stop sharing here and show you a picture of the airy epiglottic fold. Let's see if I can find that. Sometimes I get so many different drawings going, it's hard to keep track of them. There it is. Okay. So let's see if I can't share that one. So we were talking about the airy epiglottic muscle. And there's this other similar sounding term, airy epiglottic fold. So the airy epiglottic fold is this ridge here of connective tissue and with a mucosal covering that is continuous with the covering of the mucosal covering over the cartilage of the epiglottis. And in a way, it's sort of that airy epiglottic fold sort of forms the border for the opening to the larynx. So in your notes, you may remember the term laryngus additus, meaning the opening or essentially the waiting room into the larynx. And the laryngus additus is really internal to the two sides of the airy epiglottic fold. Others call this continuous sort of opening into the larynx, the region of the larynx, the laryngeal inlet. I guess thinking that it's sort of like a opening, you know, a passageway into the larynx, I guess. But that laryngeal inlet is formed by the airy epiglottic folds and the epiglottis. And all those folds attach and are continuous with mucosal covering of the arytenoid cartilages in the posterior aspect of the larynx. So where's the airy epiglottic muscle? It is really you know, some people would say it's alongside the fold. Other people would say it's really part of the different kinds of tissue that comprise the aryepiglottic fold. But as I said, it's not a muscle that was given a huge amount of attention to, with the exception of perhaps its role in protection of the airway. And you can see, looking at this picture of the laryngeal inlet, how it might do that. If the aryepiglottic muscle shortens, it's going to have an effect on the placement of the epiglottis and may help it to get into that protective sort of umbrella-like covering position so that objects and liquids are kept out of the airway. Okay, so that's enough of that. I think we'll return to aspects of phonation after spring break and after you have, maybe just after spring break and as you're preparing for the next quiz. And, you know, it'd be probably nice for you to get past quiz 4, finish up respiration before you move on to aspects of phonation and you know, the study of those muscles. So we'll come back to that. I did have one other resource that I wanted to share with you, and that is a YouTube video that is more relevant to quiz number 4. So what topics are on quiz number 4? Well, they would be the topics that you find towards the end of the section on respiration. So things like respiratory rate and the action of the respiratory muscles at various points during breathing for speech. So things like checking action come into play, and checking action along with some of the topics at the end of the physiology of respiration chapter in your book are important because they illustrate how breathing for speech is very different than the kind of tidal volume pattern that we see in breathing for life. So thinking about those topics at the end of that section, one of the big topics is volumes and capacities. There are many different videos on YouTube about volumes and capacities, but the one I'm going to show you in a moment I think is good for the nuts and bolts of trying to memorize what the volumes and capacities are. This video does not explain the volumes and capacities. That is what your textbook is for, or other kinds of websites are for. What it does is it gives you a framework to use when you're trying to memorize what are they, and if I were to draw a graph of volumes and respiratory volumes and capacities, what would that look like? So let's go ahead and take a look at this one video. And this isn't it, but I'm hoping that I can yes, it is. Okay. Okay, so this is more or less a mnemonic device to help you remember the relationship between the volumes, the different lung volumes. Now, I will say, as a reminder, the important volume and capacity for SLPs is going to be tidal volume, which will change according to the task. Remember, tidal volume during exercise looks really different from tidal volume during sort of quiet breathing. And vital capacity, the capacity that represents the maximum capability of someone's respiratory system. So keep those in mind. And let's go ahead and take a look at this video. It does feature dopey guitar music, but it's not really obnoxious music. So I'll go ahead and I'm going to play part of this to show you the general idea of the mnemonic that they have in mind. Small m and big M. So easy to draw. So they're showing you, the difference between 0 liters and maybe 6, 8 liters. So remember inspiratory reserve and expiratory reserve. Now you see vital capacity, the maximum inhalation and exhalation. Total lung capacity. That's the big M in their drawing. Okay, so we'll stop and I'll let you take a look at this in your leisure, and I'll also post the link for you, but it's basically called Lung Volume Mnemonic. You'll see if you type that in that you'll get through for other videos in addition to this. But you know what this reminds me of is the kind of writing and drawing that students do when they first get their exam and they want to regurgitate some of their knowledge immediately because it's not really in short-term memory even yet, and so they start writing on the back of a test to sort of get information out in case they want to refer to it. And that's what this M&M video reminds me of, but it would be a way to understand the relationship between these different volumes and capacities, and to also have sort of this a slightly different visual reminder of, the fact that tidal volume is what you usually inhale and exhale, but then above and below that would be inspiratory and expiratory reserve, that, total lung capacity is important, but it also includes functional reserve capacity, and we don't use that air. So it's just another way to think about some of these volumes and capacities in a way that I hope helps you memorize them for the exam and maybe makes them a little more clear. So here is in the chat the address of that YouTube video. And like I said, there are plenty of other videos. If there's another one that speaks more to you, that's great. The quiz won't ask you in the video, it won't ask you about that. The video is meant to be a tool to use to understand the respiratory volumes and capacities. And just to review, the important volumes and capacities for SLPs, those would be tidal volume. What does inhalation, exhalation look like on any given task in any given stage of the person? And vital capacity, or the maximum sort of productivity of someone's respiratory system. And vital capacity is used as an indicator of sort of overall health for someone who's recovering from some kind of a respiratory ailment. So from that standpoint, it lets you know, compared to other people of the same age and sex, what is their respiratory capability. Okay, so that's all I had for today. I'll send an announcement when the video is posted that also lets you know that I did still make an error on the start date for quiz number 4, and I'll correct that on the website, as well as correcting it in an announcement. Okay, have a good evening, and I hope you have a good spring break. For most of us, it means you'll still be working, but at least you won't have new material to cover in the course. I'll see you after break.